have of him being there, Washington Hollow, is his membership in the Presbyterian Church. 1769, there's a record of him being chosen to help renovate the Presbyterian Church in Washington Hollow, what was then called Pittsburgh. At this point, he's 24 or 25 years old. By the way, I should say, there aren't any paintings of Melancton Smith, right? There's a couple of these profile images that survive, but I'm not even sure that they were done during his lifetime. I think some of these might date to like shortly after he died. We don't really have a good sense of what he looked like. Now, does anyone recognize this?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Pleasant Valley Presbyterian Church. The Pittsburgh Presbyterian Church that Melancton Smith was a member of no longer exists, right? Shortly after he was a member there and he helped renovate it, 1760s, kind of combined with the congregation in Pleasant Valley, and although this is not the original church building, the congregation that he was part of still exists in Pleasant Valley. This is the cemetery, kind of right behind where like Porta Azul is now. You go up behind there and there's the cemetery. This was probably there when Melancton Smith kind of lived in the area. And if you want to go forward one more, you guys recognize this building? Right? There's not a lot of stuff that we can find where we can like tie it directly to Melancton Smith. There's not a lot that's physically still here. This one kind of indirectly, right? It's the antique store, right by like Troop K today. When the Presbyterian church that he was part of left Pittsburgh, Washington Hollow, the church building that they had worshipped in was still there. So they sold it to the Methodist congregation. That Methodist congregation used the building for a while, and then outgrew it or wanted a nicer building, right? So they built this one, right? This was the Methodist church that replaced the Methodist church that was the Presbyterian church that Melancton Smith went to. That's the direct connection. Now, at this point, when he's living here, he's married. He marries a woman named Sarah from New Jersey. He's fairly young. She dies after only a few years. Melancton Smith's biographer is convinced that his first wife is buried in the cemetery that we just looked at. Can't find her gravestone there. I wandered around the cemetery yesterday. The earliest one I found is from the 1790s, like 25, 30 years later. But there's reason to believe that it's kind of logical that she would be buried there. Shortly after his first wife dies, he remarries a woman from Long Island, a Quaker. Right? He's not Quaker himself. He marries a Quaker woman named Margaret Mott. Vivian, do you have a question?
Was she buried there under her maiden name?
I just don't think that those stones survive that are that old. So I think it's more of a question of just kind of time passing than the wrong name. So he marries this Quaker woman from Long Island, Margaret Mott, 1772. They live here, Charlotte Precinct. It's kind of unusual, right, for Quakers to marry outside of Quakerism. It happens from time to time. It's not encouraged for Quakers. And you kind of wonder how much of his connection to his Quaker wife kind of impacted his thinking a little bit later on in his life. Questions about slavery, for example, right, where Quakers were some of the first abolitionists. Now, it's around this time that he starts to get involved in politics. Right? He's in his late 20s. If you put this in a little bit of a broader context, right? This time period when he's living in Pittsburgh, Washington Hollow, this is the period between the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. So this is the period of the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts and the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, right? All those events that contribute to our push for independence eventually. It's pretty clear that Melancton Smith is on the side of the conflict that's hostile to British authority, right? He almost certainly belonged to the equivalent of the Sons of Liberty in Dutchess County. There are a few documents that talk about his kind of love of liberty, his zeal for liberty. He's thinking in political terms, right? You can see that in his letters. The first two offices that he's chosen for the Charlotte precinct of town government. He's chosen as poor master. This is the position that is making sure that the poor in the community have what they need in order to survive. He's also chosen as highway overseer, making sure that the roads are maintained. These are fairly low-level positions, they're local positions, but this is him dipping his toe in a political life. Now, that's 1773. That's the same year as the Boston Tea Party. 2 years later, two things that are pretty important occur. One, the Revolutionary War actually starts, right? The first shots are fired in Lexington. And two, Melancton Smith moves from being a kind of local town official to being one of 10 representatives from Dutchess County elected to the New York State Provincial Congress. It's not technically a state then, but New York's Provincial Congress, right? 1775. He's gone from town government all the way to kind of colony-wide government. Now, as the fighting kind of picks up and independence becomes closer, he starts to play a central role here in Dutchess County. In early 1776, so the fighting has been going on for a few months. We haven't declared independence yet. He is chosen as the captain for Dutchess County's militia men, Minutemen. Right? Shortly thereafter, he says, you know what, having Minutemen, kind of soldiers at the ready, is not enough for Dutchess County. Right? There's a lot of loyalists in Dutchess County. We got to have a full-time, kind of permanent force. So he helps spearhead the creation of what are known as Dutchess County Rangers. 100 people, full-time, who are kind of like a home guard. Right? They're not part of the Continental Army, they're not going to the battlefront, they're kind of keeping Dutchess County safe and keeping track of loyalists in Dutchess County, making sure that they're not getting up to too much trouble. So clearly he's a respected figure, right? He's chosen as an officer, and people look up to him. He's only in his very early 30s, right, at this point. To me, kind of the most interesting position that he has during the Revolution is he is one of few people who are given the task of detecting and defeating conspiracies which may be formed in this state against the liberties of America. It's a great title, right? He's basically in charge of rooting out loyalists, right, in Dutchess County. You know, you got to remember, the American Revolution, in many ways, is a kind of civil war, right? Most accounts say that, you know, probably about 40% of the Americans are active rebels, active patriots, you know, contributing to the independence movement. Probably about 20% of the people here are committed loyalists, right, opposing a break with Britain. And Dutchess County is the same way, right? There's a split here. There's a divide. So Melancton Smith's job is keep track of those loyalists. And they are not treated especially well. You know, it's relatively common for loyalists in Dutchess County and other parts of New York State to be forced to move kind of behind enemy lines into British-held territory, like the southern part of New York. Often their land is confiscated from them. I'll just mention two names, right, from this community. Samuel and Joseph Mabbitt. Right? You guys recognize that name, Mabbitt? Right? There's Mabbittsville, right, which is a community in the town of Washington. They appear on a list of loyalists, right, in Charlotte precinct. Normally, in a circumstance like that, they'd have their land confiscated, they might be deported. I mean, that could happen. But it doesn't happen to them. Right? And you kind of wonder, you know, to what degree is this about personal relationships? You know, does Melancton Smith know these people? Has he kind of interacted in his capacity as a businessman with these people? You don't know. These things were kind of sporadically enforced.
Was he mayor of Mabbittsville at the time?
I don't think Mabbittsville exists at the time. I think it comes a little bit later and it's named after that family.
After independence.
Yeah. This is all still Charlotte precinct. Now, my favorite story, kind of in this capacity of him trying to root out loyalists in Dutchess County, involves Quakers, right? Because it directly involves this community. You know, Quakers, for the most part, are sitting this war out, right? They're pacifists. Sometimes they're accused of being loyalists. I mean, for the most part, they just don't want to participate. But if you know about kind of Quaker organization, they have all these local communities, like the one in Millbrook, but they always tend to go to their yearly meeting, right? They have like a yearly meeting, a yearly convention that they have to attend. And for the people living up here in the 1770s, that meant going to Flushing, right? Pretty far south. The problem with that is that Flushing, like a lot of, kind of southern New York during this time, is behind enemy lines, right? And traveling behind enemy lines is potentially a capital offense, right? If you don't have permission, if you don't have authority to do that. It makes you very suspect. So a handful of Quakers from up here, including a couple names you might recognize, right? Jonathan Dean, Joshua Haight, right? These are names that have long association, right, with Millbrook community. A guy named Trip Mosher, right, who goes on after the war to be one of the founders and one of the first superintendents of the Nine Partners boarding school. They're part of this group that travels down to Flushing. When they come back, they are apprehended in Poughkeepsie by Melancton Smith's forces, right, this kind of home guard. And they're arrested. They are sent, right, to a prison ship, the Hudson River, kind of near the Esopus Creek, so up by like Saugerties today. They're up there for like a couple months. Clearly Melancton Smith is uncomfortable with this situation, right? He lives here, he knows Quakers, he's married to a Quaker, he knows that they're not really disloyal, that they don't belong on that prison ship. So he does everything he can to try to get them released. He kind of like backs off and makes an offer. He says, all right, you know, we'll let you go from the prison ship if you just kind of pay for the cost of us putting you up on this luxurious prison ship. Right? Being good Quakers, they say, no, we did nothing wrong. We will not pay your fine. Right? Like it's a typical kind of Quaker response. And eventually Melancton Smith backs down completely and says, okay, we'll release you like on parole and we'll deal with you later, and then just forgets about it. Right? So this is the kind of thing he's dealing with. It's a lot of personal relationships. It's a lot of like, who's really disloyal? You know, there's lots of examples of loyalist property being confiscated, and then people like Melancton Smith and like Philip Hart, right, a name we associate with Millbrook, buying up loyalist land. So there's kind of some, I don't know if you call it self-dealing here, but at least the appearance of self-dealing occasionally. Now, by 1777, Smith gets probably his most important position in Dutchess County. He's elected Dutchess County Sheriff, which is a yearly position, but he's chosen 4 times for that position. Right? So he serves for most of the war as Dutchess County Sheriff. And it's not exactly what we think of when you hear the word sheriff today. It's not necessarily exclusively a law enforcement kind of position. He's in charge of all the courts in Dutchess County. He's in charge of overseeing elections in Dutchess County. And it's a pretty powerful position within Dutchess County to be sheriff. It's a reflection of kind of the respect that people have for Melancton Smith at this point, in part because of his service kind of early on in the war. Probably the most significant thing, at least in my view, that he does as sheriff of Dutchess County is overseeing the gubernatorial election 1777. It's a really big election, right? It's like the first big election for governor of New York after independence, under the new New York State Constitution. Everybody kind of assumes that Philip Schuyler is going to win this thing, right? He is part of kind of the elite of New York State. Incidentally, I used to give tours at Philip Schuyler's house in Albany. I used to be a real Philip Schuyler partisan, but now I have nothing but disdain for him. Now I'm just and he's running against George Clinton, right? Both Schuyler and Clinton have been generals early on in the Revolution. And the way voting worked at this time, you know, there's no expectation of a secret ballot, right? Often people voted what's called viva voce. They just voted out loud, said who they supported, a public meeting. there's problems with that, and there's especially problems with that in the context of the way Dutchess County was in the 1770s. Dutchess County in the 1770s was essentially like a quasi-feudal system, where you had a small group of very, very powerful and wealthy landowners who dominated the county, and then a whole bunch of tenant farmers who rented land from them. So you can see if people are voting out loud, there's a lot of intimidation that's at play. Kind of the feudal lords of Dutchess County have control over who their tenants can vote for, right? At least influence over who their tenants can vote for. So what Melancton Smith does, he says, we're going to have a secret ballot. Right? This frees up the tenant farmers, right? Kind of the ordinary rank and file of Dutchess County, to vote for whoever they want. And instead of Schuyler winning, which kind of everybody assumed, right, George Clinton wins. For the rest of their lives, right, Melancton Smith, George Clinton are political allies. Right? Not always on the same side of every issue, right? But close allies. Now, after the war ends, Melancton Smith leaves Dutchess County. Right? He goes to New York City, 1784. Largely for financial reasons, right? Commercial opportunities are greater in New York City. There's an old map of New York from around this time. The area that Melancton Smith moved to is right here. This is the very southern tip of Manhattan. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I think it's called Quinty's Slip. There's still actually a street with that name in that area. This is very close to where the Staten Island ferry terminal is. Real kind of southern part of Manhattan. He lives there for the rest of his life. Prospers as a businessman, as a merchant. At one point, he actually has a commercial transaction with George Washington. He's importing stuff, and Washington kind of hires him to import some what's described as plate, which I'm assuming is like kind of something covered in silver, right? Silverware or something like that. It takes Melancton Smith so long to actually acquire this and give it to Washington that Washington assumes it's never coming and orders another set of it from some other merchant, and ultimately he ends up with both, and he writes this very annoyed letter to Melancton Smith saying, like, you kind of screwed this up. I wouldn't have ordered this other set if you had done this right the first time. There's kind of a little bit of an interaction between them. It's during his time in New York City, Melancton Smith goes from someone who served in town government and county government and colonial government, state government essentially, someone who served in the federal government. 1785, he is elected to represent New York in Congress, called the Confederation Congress. By most accounts, he does a pretty good job serving 3 years there in Congress, although some people look at him with kind of a little bit of condescension. There's one representative from North Carolina, a guy named William Blunt, who describes him as, I love this phrase, an anti-federal peasant. Right? Very dismissive of Melancton Smith, because he doesn't come from an American aristocracy, right? Like a lot of the representatives do. He generally serves with distinction. He consistently opposes slavery. He's a member of the New York Manumission Society, right? As is Alexander Hamilton. He advocates for Indian rights. He advocates for religious liberty. Right? So a lot of things that we could relate to, a lot of things that we could get behind today. He plays an important role in probably the two most important things that this Confederation Congress accomplishes. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Basically dealing with all of this Western land, right, that the country has acquired as a result of their victory over Britain in 1783. Right? He is very supportive of one of the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that bans slavery from the territory. Right? He's one of the few people of his kind of economic status, because he's a fairly prosperous merchant, who never owns slaves. Right? Never does. Right? Many people in New York in the 1780s own slaves. He doesn't. Now, By this point, 1787, it is clear that the Articles of Confederation are not sufficient, right? The country has entered an economic downturn, and in the summer of 1787, Constitutional Convention is held in Philadelphia to replace the Articles of Confederation with something stronger, something better. Melancton Smith is not part of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. There are 3 representatives from New York: Alexander Hamilton, Robert Yates, John Lansing. Melancton Smith is not one of them. But that Constitutional Convention produces a document, the Constitution that we still have in place today, 31 years later. And in that document it said, in order for this thing to take effect, 9 of the 13 states in the country, 1787, have to ratify it. Right? 9 of the 13 have to ratify it, and then it kicks in for those 9 states. So what happens here, late 1787, early 1788, all 13 states have to decide what they're going to do. Accept this, reject this. Delaware is the first state to ratify the Constitution, which is why it says what on Delaware's license plate?
Constitution State.
The first state. Now that's kind of a ridiculous claim, right? Because in 1787, states had existed already for 11 years. So what's the first state? It's a 13-way tie between all of them, July 4th, 1776. But what else is Delaware going to put on its license plate? Like, we charge you exorbitant tolls when you're passing through us to go somewhere else. Like, it's, sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent. So by May of 1788, what? 8, 9 months after the Constitutional Convention broke up, 8 states have ratified. 3 of them have ratified unanimously. There aren't any no votes. But you need 9. Right? It's exactly at this time that New York decides to hold its ratifying convention. Figure out what it's going to do. I've got to look at a little context here, right? For why New York is slow out of the gate ratifying, why it seems like it's not eager to accept this new form of government. One of the problems that existed under the Articles of Confederation was that the federal government had almost no ability to raise revenue, right? They couldn't tax people directly. And they needed money, right? Pay off its war debts. What they tried to do, right, to raise revenue is to create what's called an import tax, an import duty. Right? Tax all of the goods that are coming into the country. Now, a lot of those goods were coming in through the port of New York. And New York refused to go along with this national import duty because they had their own state import duty. Right? If stuff was coming in through New York Harbor, New York State was taxing it. It doesn't want to give up that revenue stream. They got about half of all of their revenue from this import duty. Which means that in New York, there's fairly low real estate taxes compared to other states in the 1780s, right? Because they had this great stream of revenue, all this trade coming in through the port of New York. So they don't want to give that up, right? They don't want to relinquish that. There's opposition to ratification for that kind of selfish pecuniary reason. Now, when New York State has to figure out, like, who are the delegates who are going to come to this meeting and decide, they said, all right, we're going to have 65 people. Right? All the different states like come up with their own number of how many delegates. Massachusetts has like 350 people at its ratifying convention. New York has 65, because that's how many assembly districts there are in New York State. And they have this election to choose delegates from every county in New York. And the way this election works, it's incredibly democratic. Right? Most elections in New York State in the 1780s, you have to have a certain amount of property in order to vote. Like to vote for assembly, you have to have about 20 pounds worth of property, or the equivalent of that. To vote for delegates in this ratifying convention, all you have to be is a white man. No property requirement. So this is probably the most democratic election that New York State has held up to this point in its history. right? Mass participation. And it is an intensely fought election. There's lots of negative campaigning, mudslinging. This is my favorite line. One Federalist wrote this about anti-Federalists like Melancton Smith. The antis are the witches in Macbeth, dancing around the cauldron of sedition, each throwing in his proportion of spells for the confusion of the country. Kind of like that line. In Newburgh, right, not too far from here, supporters of the Constitution, Federalists, nominated a separate group of anti-Federalists to try to confuse anti-Federalist voters. Right? So lots of dirty tricks, right? Not too different from politics today. In the end, of these 65 positions, like I said at the beginning of the talk, 46 of them are filled by people who have spoken out in opposition to the Constitution. Now some of them are like, hell no, we're never going to have this Constitution. And some of them say, maybe, but with conditions. So there's kind of a range of opinions within that 46. But only 19 are admitted Federalists, want to ratify this thing straight off the bat. Like I said, a lot of important people. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, George Clinton, Robert Yates and John Lansing, right, who were the two New York members of the Constitutional Convention the previous year, and Melancton Smith. Melancton Smith, although he's living in New York City at this time, right, he's been there for, what, about 4 years at this point? He's elected from Dutchess County because there's a huge geographical divide in the state. I forgot to show you this. This is like the neighborhood where Melancton Smith lived in New York City, which is kind of cool because it's one of the few places in Lower Manhattan where you can actually get a sense of what it used to look like. I mean, it didn't look like this when Melancton Smith was there, but this is like kind of early 19th century, so a few decades later. There's a park, right, named after the neighborhood where he lived. All right. We'll get to that in a second. So Melancton Smith is elected from Dutchess County because there's a huge geographical divide. New York City is heavily Federalist. They want the Constitution, right? A lot of businessmen there. It's the home of the national government, right, New York. So there are 9 delegates elected from Manhattan. All 9 are Federalists. There's 7 delegates, including Melancton Smith, nominated from Dutchess County. All 7 are anti-Federalists, right? And that's the way it worked usually, kind of county to county. It wasn't too much of a split. You were kind of one way or the other. One of my favorite lines that I found was when Melancton Smith was chosen, somebody wrote in to the Poughkeepsie Country Journal, kind of complaining about Melancton Smith. And their complaint was that, hey, how could we possibly elect this guy to represent Dutchess County? He lives in New York City, right? Here's what they said. Why go to New York and search for, quote, proper characters to represent the discerning and independent yeomanry of Dutchess? It is not the individual singly, but the individual as a citizen of New York that we object to. To me, that has so much contemporary resonance, right? Because like any congressional race today, like the first accusation is, this person's not from here. This person really lives in New York City. Like they're saying the same thing in 1788, right? He's not one of us. He hasn't lived here for 4 years, right? I love that kind of criticism. Now, to give you a little kind of context here. This is where the ratifying convention met, Poughkeepsie Courthouse. There aren't too many images of it that survive. It hasn't existed since the early 19th century. It burned down in the early 19th century, not that long after the ratifying convention was held. That's one image of it. There's another one here, right? You can see, 1792, so right around the time that the convention was held. It was a pretty grand building for Poughkeepsie. Poughkeepsie at this time had 2,500 residents. 200 of them were slaves. 1780s. So to put that in perspective, Poughkeepsie in 1788 was probably about 50% larger than the village of Millbrook is today. So it's not like a major metropolis, right? It's a town, right? Poughkeepsie. It's geographically central, right? That's why the convention is held there. So first thing they do right off the bat, these 65 delegates meet in Poughkeepsie. They say, all right, are we going to accept this thing as is, ratify it, join the union, or are we going to set conditions? Right? Are we going to ratify this thing with demands? And they go about this in a very systematic way. Right? They go through every line of the Constitution, line by line, and have just open discussion. And you can propose amendments, you can say whatever you want, open discussion about what you think. And Melancton Smith spoke more than just about anyone. There's 65 people there, but there's only about a dozen who participate actively in the debates. Right? Hamilton probably spoke the most, as was his wont, sometimes for like hours on end. But Melancton Smith was probably the most kind of common champion of the anti-federalist side. One of the first things that he criticizes, the 3/5 compromise, which we talked about in class today, right? 3/5 compromise. Right? This is the thing that gave southern states with large slave populations essentially bonus representation in the House of Representatives, the Electoral College. Smith says that giving more power to slave states is terrible. Right? You're essentially giving them power for acting in a wicked way. He uses that word, wicked. He says it's utterly repugnant to his feelings, the 3/5 compromise. So do we see the influence maybe of Quakerism there? You know, it's hard to know. It's hard to identify that. Now, throughout these debates, they are intensely focused on like fundamental issues of representation and taxation. They never get distracted with like minor issues. They never get really too far away from kind of the core arguments over the Constitution. Right? The first thing that Melancton Smith really proposes as a change, a formal amendment to the Constitution, has to do with representation. The Constitution says that there'll be one member of the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people. Melancton Smith thinks that's not good enough. Right? How can a representative possibly understand the interests of 30,000 constituents? Right? Need a smaller number. He says, let's lower that to 20,000. Probably he would want it lower, but that's what he thinks is reasonable. He had a very kind of interesting notion of representation. He said that a representative should, quote, be a true picture of the people, possess the knowledge of their circumstances and their wants, sympathize in all their distresses, and be disposed to seek their true interests. That was his notion of representation. He did not want rule by betters, rule by kind of an aristocratic elite. He wanted rule by people like him, from the middling classes. He thought they knew the circumstances of the citizenry best. They should be the ones in political power. One of the Federalists at this meeting, Robert Livingston, responded to Melancton Smith's notion of representation by the middling classes by saying this. If Melancton Smith didn't want the elite to represent him, quote, who then? Why, those who are not virtuous, those who are not wise, those who are not learned? To find the men Smith wants, he must go out into the highways and pick up the rogue and the robber, or the hedges and ditches, and bring in the poor, the blind, and the lame.
Oh, dear.
That is not really a fair characterization of what Melancton Smith is saying, but Robert Livingston is just like dripping with sarcasm and disdain in his comment. Like the crowd that was there, like that, you know, that was entertaining for like, you know, a couple hundred people watching in the audience, but it wasn't effective at all. Right? Melancton Smith responded to that attack by simply saying, to irritate is not the way to conciliate. Right? He's always very pragmatic. He's always very level-headed. Right? Now, probably, the guy who had the most success from the Federalist perspective was not Hamilton, who was constantly speaking, often off-topic, or Robert Livingston, who was using sarcasm. It was probably John Jay. John Jay was not a great speaker. He didn't speak as much as those other people in the debates. But the ratifying convention only met like 4 hours a day, at least at the start, 10 to 2. It's a nice kind of work day for him. There's a lot of downtime when these people are in Poughkeepsie. John Jay was a master kind of seeking people out after hours and talking to them in a calm, reasonable way. You know, John Jay understood math, and he understood that there's 46 anti-federalists and 19 federalists, right? You can't just like stand up and give eloquent speeches and assume that you're going to get your way. So he's kind of working behind the scenes to convince people, right, to support the Constitution. Essentially, it came down to this. The anti-federalist position, Melancton Smith's position was, okay, we will ratify the Constitution, but the country has to hold a second constitutional convention, dramatically change the Constitution based on things that we and other states suggest, and until that happens, the federal government cannot really use all of its powers over New York. Like the power to directly tax people, they can't use it. This is very conditional ratification, right? This is ratification, but like, not really, right? You can't actually use your authority over us. But external events forced Melancton Smith, the other anti-federalists in Poughkeepsie, to kind of change their tune. Like I said, before they start meeting, 8 states had ratified. You need 9 in order to make this official. During the meeting in Poughkeepsie, news that New Hampshire ratified the Constitution arrives. Alexander Hamilton was so eager for this news to arrive in Poughkeepsie that he personally hired a guy on a horse to ride as fast as he could from New Hampshire to Poughkeepsie so that he could get the news before anyone else and tell people. So 9 means this thing is taking effect one way or the other. Around the same time, a 10th state, Virginia, ratifies. Like, all right, New Hampshire's important because it's number 9, but Virginia's got the most people in the Union. That's really important. Now, on the outside of this thing is New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, that like never wants to be part of anything. Right? So we're kind of in the minority here. And there's some practical considerations at play. For example, if this thing is actually going to take effect, this new government's going to kick in, well, New York's on the outside. New York doesn't get to have congresspeople. New York doesn't get to participate in the Electoral College and have a say in who the first president is going to be. A lot of important stuff is going to happen in the early days of this new government, and we're going to be sitting on the sidelines. There's also the question of, well, where's the national capital going to be, right? At this point, it's New York City. If New York is not part of the Union, New York City can no longer be the national capital, right? That's going to hurt kind of the bottom line of businessmen in New York, people like Melancton Smith. And then there's also these rumors that, hey, the country is so, that the state, I should say, is so divided along geographical lines that, like, if New York State doesn't agree to ratify, New York City, maybe Westchester County, will secede from New York State. They will join the Union, leaving Dutchess and the rest kind of out in the cold. Right? You don't want that to happen. All these very practical concerns. So Melancton Smith, as the leader of the Anti-Federalists, kind of changes his tune a little bit. You can kind of almost see him like negotiating against himself sometimes with these positions, but he's trying to do what he thinks is practical. He says, all right, we will ratify, but if you don't agree to a Bill of Rights, if you don't add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution within a 2-year window, our ratification is null and void. We're out. It's like an escape clause for New York's ratification. Other anti-federalists, people who are on Melancton Smith's side, don't like that offer. Right? They think Melancton Smith has become like a turncoat here, right? They think he's as bad as Alexander Hamilton. Right? But he's able to bring enough people with him in order to like remain relevant. Right? Ultimately, he backs down even further. What that last proposal said was, all right, New York is going to ratify upon condition that a Bill of Rights is added to the Constitution. They subtly changed the language of that. It has a huge impact. Instead of upon condition, they changed the language to read in full confidence of. Right? Subtle, but the meaning there is completely different. Right? There's no threat necessarily of revoking our ratification if you use that phrase. That's what Melancton Smith proposes. That's what he supports. When they vote on this, the vote is 31 to 29 in favor.
Whoa.
Right? The closest margin, right? Essentially a margin of one vote. Melancton Smith votes in favor. He's able to bring over 3 other anti-federalists from Dutchess County to vote in favor. His political patron, George Clinton, votes no. They're on the opposite side of this issue. Right? When the final vote is taken, it's 30 to 27 in favor. Right? Almost the same number. We join the Union. We avert disaster. I think Melancton Smith deserves a lot of credit for this. Right? He is endangering his own political future. A couple years after the Constitution is ratified, New York State has to decide who they're going to nominate for U.S. Senate. Supporters of George Clinton decide they don't want Melancton Smith in that job because basically he turned against them in this ratifying convention. Right? He could have been a U.S. Senator, but instead, right, he kind of was loyal to his conscience. Right? He did what the founders said was necessary in order for this new experiment in government to work. He was selfless. He was disinterested. Right? He didn't do what was good for his own career. He did what he thought was best for New York, right, and for the country. All right, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, do you want to show the map here real quick? Oh, that's the site of where the convention took place. So obviously the building is no longer there, but there's a plaque on that spot that references the meeting of the convention.
In Poughkeepsie.
In Poughkeepsie, yep, Market Street, yep. This is kind of an interesting map that just shows you where different Federalists and Anti-Federalists were coming from, right? Like Manhattan, Richmond County, Staten Island, Westchester County, pretty much all Federalist. Everything else, heavily Anti-Federalist. And the last one, anybody know where this is?
Poughkeepsie Post Office.
Yeah, this is the Poughkeepsie Post Office. These are murals that were done during FDR's time, right? A WPA project. And this actually is a scene painted in the 1930s of the ratifying convention. Anybody want to guess which one Melancton Smith is? We tell. Of course, we had no idea what he looked like, right? So this is just invented, an artist idea. So this is Hamilton. Kind of recognize Hamilton. This is George Clinton. And then here's Melancton Smith. And I'm patting George Clinton on the back. So he's that good. So if you're ever in Poughkeepsie Post Office, check this out.
It's upstairs.
Yeah.
It's upstairs.
Oh, so it's hard to, can you see it?
You used to be, I haven't asked lately to do that, sometimes they have that chained off, but I think you can ask the postmaster and go upstairs and see the ones that are upstairs.
That'll keep you out. All right. Any questions?
When land was confiscated from the Loyalists, you may not know this at all, they confiscated the land, and then who did the people buy it from? How did that work? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so the question is about when land was confiscated from the Loyalists during the Revolution, what happened to it? Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, it would sometimes be sold off, and even Melancton Smith, who played a role in having the land confiscated, sometimes bought the land
From whom?
from the government
What the government had it. I mean,
Yeah, some
there
government
wasn't actually,
agency.
was there really a government then?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. There was a state government, there was a county government, yeah, absolutely.
So the,
Melancton Smith
moved back
was
to
part of
Dutchess.
it.
So
You know, one of the big issues in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War was the treatment of Loyalists. So in that treaty that ended the war, the British extracted a promise from us saying, all right, Loyalist land will be returned. That often didn't happen. It was a very contentious issue because this land had changed hands a few times sometimes by this point. But it was something that Britain wanted in the Treaty of Paris. Let's make these Loyalists whole again.
I just wondered, because I was looking at, land transfers from down in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and it said how people that were up in Nova Scotia, which I'm assuming were Loyalists, were being, their land was being sold, and how they were agreeing to the sale of it. So that's what I was
Yeah, so what eventually happened to him? We ended the story in Poughkeepsie. Not a lot. He served in state government again in the assembly, but never any high political office. He dies in New York City in 1798. He's 54 years old. His wife outlives him by 21 years. He's one of the first victims of the yellow fever when it arrives in New York in 1798 and causes all kinds of havoc.
Was the Mott that was his second wife related to Lucretia Mott?
That was the topic of my last presentation last year, Lucretia Mott. I don't know. Lucretia Mott is from Nantucket,
Yes.
and she's from Long Island. I have no idea. I think it's a pretty common name.
Well, the Quaker.
Yeah, Quaker name.
Quakers,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, but I don't know. I want to assume so. Any other questions? All right. Yeah.
Did he have any children?
I don't actually know anything about his children. There's not a lot of records of that. I don't even know what his first wife died of. I think it's reasonable to assume that maybe she died in childbirth. It's common, but she's very young. But I don't know. I will say this: his brother Sam, who owned the grist mill in Pleasant Valley with him and who owned land in Charlotte with him, had descendants living in Pleasant Valley until the middle of the 20th century. There was a connection here for a while. All right. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. We've got some